Hello everyone, and welcome. In this video we are talking about how miserable is it honestly to take a road trip in a Tesla. In this case we are in my Tesla Model 3 Performance, and I just drove it 2,000 miles. So first off, a huge thank you to Autotempest.com for sponsoring this video. We'll get more into it at the end of the video, but just know that if you go to Autotempest.com, it's a really awesome website for looking for a used car. So they compile all the search results out there of the major used car websites out there, and they put it all in one spot. Super helpful. I use it all the time. I love it. But in this video, we're talking about Tesla road trip. So I went 2,000 miles, 1963 miles. Ironically, the year I was born, 1963. So that's how far I went. It took 3 days to do that. Total time that it took to do that, actually driving and charging, including both, was about 38 hours. Now, if you go on Google Maps and you put in the point-to-point of where I drove, it actually says it will take 27 hours. So this took 11 hours longer than Google Maps says it will take. Keep in mind that Google Maps is not going to include you stopping for gas. It doesn't know what traffic's going to be over those 3 days of driving. It doesn't know if there's going to be road construction popping up, things like that. So I did run into some traffic, some road construction, those kind of things that also add delays to it. But there certainly is a significant portion of time where you are actually charging. So if you like to stop and eat, it's not going to be all that different. If you like to just grab something and keep driving, then it will be significantly faster to drive a gasoline car versus an electric. So the total amount of time that my car was sitting at a charger for those 38 hours that it took to drive those 2,000 miles was 7 hours and 50 minutes. So about 8 hours of total charging time spent. Now, I was stopping and eating during those stops while it was charging, and it generally took the average was about 40 minutes. There were 12 total stops taken. But averaging 40 minutes for each stop, and generally speaking, I would just either eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner around that stop. The way it works out kind of logistically is you drive for about 200 miles, that takes about 3 hours, and then you stop for about 50 minutes while you let the car charge. So 200 miles, wait for 50 minutes, 200 miles, wait for 50 minutes. The first day, you can go a pretty significant distance. So the first day, I actually drove 919 miles total in one day. So if you need to go really far in an EV, yeah, it's going to take the whole day, but it can be done. You just consider that you're going to be driving for about 200 miles, then you're going to charge for about 50. Now, I was including a 15% safety buffer and battery for that entire trip. So I never left a supercharger if it said that I wouldn't get to the next supercharger under 15% battery. So I made sure that I always had enough range to get there with a 15% buffer. Now that 15% buffer is about 40 miles of range at the speed I was driving at. So I was driving at 75 miles per hour, and I maintained that 75 miles per hour pretty much the entire trip. So if the speed limit was 80, I was still doing 75. That's exactly what I do in my Crosstrek. In the Crosstrek, once you hit 80, it's just like crazy loud in there. The road noise, the wind noise, it's not as efficient. So generally speaking, on highways, I drive at 75 miles per hour. I didn't change that. Can you drive at 80 in it? Yes. Does it decrease your efficiency and your range? Yes, there is a noticeable difference. Reason being, as your speed increases, the amount of power required to overcome aerodynamic drag is increasing exponentially. So it does take more power to drive at 80 versus 75. I did do a little looking at this on the little energy map. It's basically a game of you're playing how much risk do you want to have. So I was driving at 75 miles per hour, and I knew that doing that, I'd have that 15% buffer in order to get to where I'm going. And if anything happened, kind of a mishap during the trip, or if it was going uphill for a long time, or if it was really windy, I had that 15% buffer, which is good for about 40 miles. Now you can also just decrease your speed. If you're really low on range, you can just decrease your speed, and that will give you, much more efficient driving, and you'll be able to increase the range that you're able to travel. So as far as the charging, we took 12 total stops for those 2,000 miles specifically to charge. So of those 12 stops, the average time was about 40 minutes. The longest time was 52 minutes, and that wasn't because I needed to wait there that long. It was because we were eating. We finished after 52 minutes, and then off we went. So generally speaking, you'll have enough range to go to the next stop after about 40 to 45 minutes. I generally waited till about 50 minutes to make sure I had a little bit of a safety buffer, because this was my first time doing an electric car road trip. The shortest time we spent at a charger was just 10 minutes, and it actually went up about 20% in those 10 minutes, and that was enough to get us to the next spot with plenty of range. All right, so what are the variables going on here? Because I'm sure you're curious about that as far as the efficiency is related to what I was actually doing in the car. So as I mentioned, speed was at 75 miles per hour. There were two of us in the car for the entire time, and the car was fully loaded with stuff. Now, it had enough visibility to look out the rear windows and the side windows, but the car was packed with stuff, and it actually is pretty impressive how much stuff you can fit into this car, including that front trunk, and then there's that like kind of secret rear trunk below the main rear trunk. So there's a ton of space in this thing. I'll show you kind of a short video of what I was able to fit in here, and so it's quite a bit of stuff, plus two people. So there was a good amount of weight in the car. That's one thing to consider, especially important if you're going uphill, or if you're in like short stop and go traffic where you have to accelerate that mass over and over again. Now, of course, more mass does mean more regen, but ultimately that's a losing battle. The more weight you have in the car, the less range you're going to have, and you also have increased rolling resistance. Other variables, I did have the AC on for pretty much the majority of the drive. It wasn't super hot outside, but it was pretty much always sunny, and it does kind of heat up this cabin if it is sunny outside. So I would say it was probably in the mid 70s for most of the journey, sometimes hitting around 80 degrees outside. But overall, it was warm enough outside and sunny always so that the AC needed to be on. So the AC was pretty much on the entire time. I had music going the entire time. I had my phone plugged in, charging for that drive. So, pretty much all the variables were happening that were not in my favor. The car's fully loaded. I'm using the AC, that kind of thing. The only thing is that temperature outside wasn't really cold. So if it was really cold, that would significantly reduce range. I don't know to what degree because I haven't done that yet, but it would change probably more so than using the accessories. The accessories really don't play a huge role in how much range you have. And then when you come up to traffic, you might think, uh-oh, I'm now in traffic and now I'm going to lose all this range because I've got my AC going, that kind of thing. But in reality, when you're in traffic, and I did run into it, and you're traveling at low speeds, at those very low speeds, it actually turns out to be really efficient. So the city rating is better than the highway rating. It gets better mile per gallon in the city. And so driving in that kind of high traffic conditions, you have plenty of range, even if you're running AC and that kind of thing. So that was actually nice to see. The estimated range that it would have would actually increase when I came into those high traffic scenarios, because you get the regen every time you stop and you're not traveling at that high of speeds. So there's not very high aerodynamic drag losses. Overall, it's a really efficient way for the car to travel at low speed. So if you do run into traffic, it's not a huge deal, unless I guess you're just sitting there like literally all day long running the AC and not moving. But generally speaking, if you're moving at all in that traffic, then it's going to have plenty of range, and it's actually going to operate somewhat efficiently in that range. Now, speaking of efficiency, this is something that actually gets me really excited, and it was very cool to see, because this car traveled 2,000 miles on the equivalent amount of energy of 16.5 gallons of gas. And that happens to be less than the fuel tank size for my Subaru Crosstrek. So what that means is if my Subaru Crosstrek were as efficient as this Tesla Model 3, I could have done that entire 2,000 mile drive on one tank of gas. And that really tells us two things. First of all, it shows you how wildly inefficient internal combustion engines are. And then second of all, it shows you how wildly non-dense electric batteries are. The battery in this car is only a little more than 2 gallons of gasoline in energy equivalency, but it's so efficient that you can go really far on that. So my longest stint of the drive was 221 miles, and that took 78% of the battery of this car's battery to do it, to go 221 miles. So if I look at the energy efficiency of my most efficient leg of the drive or my least efficient leg of the drive, and then convert that to the equivalent range that the car would have, the longest range this car would have on highway driving at 75 miles an hour with all the variables that I told you is 286 miles. And the shortest range possible that I had experienced during my drive with a full battery, how far it could go, was about 223 miles. Now, Tesla claims that, based on its highway MPG rating, that this thing is good for about 250 miles with a full charge on the highway. Now, those 250 miles of range on the highway are assuming Tesla's highway MPG equivalent of 112. For the average of my trip, I got 118 MPGe, about the equivalent. So 118 15 miles per gallon equivalency, and so I was doing better than what Tesla is rated for on the highway with all of those variables. So it is a very efficient machine, and you know, you're going to be getting those 200 miles of range between your little charging stops with that 15% buffer left over in case something were to go wrong. Now, if you want to tempt fate, then you can drive faster than I drove, and you can spend less time at chargers than I spent, and you're going to be getting into those lower battery regions, but that's where it charges very quickly, and you know, so it's just dependent on how much risk do you want to take. In this case, I was making sure I had that 15% buffer, and I did just fine. Overall, the entire trip took 560 kilowatt hours for my vehicle, and so that's the equivalent of about 7.5 full batteries in order to go those 2,000 miles. Okay, so how about the journey itself? What was it like in this vehicle? And actually, I was pleasantly surprised with how nice it was. We were spending very long days, especially that 919 mile day in this car. Neither of us had any complaints about comfort. These seats are extremely comfortable. They're not like race car seats where they're going to hug you and like keep you real snug, but they're very plush. And so as a result, I never got sore. My back never hurt. My butt never hurt. I felt fine for the entire trip as far as comfort. I could just sit in this thing all day and not worry about it. So that was actually really nice. Tire noise isn't too bad at 75 miles an hour. Wind noise isn't too bad. Overall, it's pretty quiet in here. You got your sound system going, and it's a very nice environment to be. Additionally, if you happen to have one of these large, I just filled this thing up with iced tea. It's a Toyota Supra thermos. Fits wonderfully in both the cup holder as well as the side holder over here. So if you happen to be a Supra enthusiast, perhaps this is the car for you. That doesn't make any sense. But either way, the water bottle fits really well in here. Good location for that. Tons of storage in here, which is nice for road trips. Good convenient locations to put everything. So I like that. Now, the suspension itself is fairly firm, and this is the performance model, so that's somewhat to be expected. It's a little bit lower than the regular Tesla Model 3, so a little firm as far as the ride quality, but I think what compensates for that perfectly is the fact that these seats are very comfortable, very well cushioned. Like, there's quite a bit. I don't weigh all that much. I don't know if you can tell by the size of my wrists, but I don't weigh all that much, and so usually seats are on the firm side for me just because of that. And this car actually kind of sink in a bit, and it's really comfortable, and it evenly distributes the pressure of me sitting on it. All right, so what about Autopilot? Well, here comes some unenjoyable news for all the massive Tesla enthusiasts out there. I don't have Autopilot. I think it's cool. I think it's great. I just don't have a problem driving. 2,000 miles, I happen to use my own hands in order to turn the wheel. I know it's a crazy concept, but it's not that big of a deal to me. So I do not have Autopilot. I did not use it. I just have the regular cruise control. It's actually really nice and really easy to use. If you do like a fast swipe up, it goes up 5 miles per hour. If you go a fast swipe down, it goes down 5 miles per hour. If you just do one at a time, you can have incremental increase of just 1 mile per hour. So it's really easy to use this wheel. I like the wheel method rather than like a button method. A lot of cruise control systems often have a little switch that you have to push up or down, and I really like the wheel here. It makes it really easy. And because this has regen, you can actually, if you're coming up on a car fast and you just swipe that wheel down, you'll actually slow down really quickly. So you don't actually have to touch the brake very often at all. You can do all of it with your hand. I know it's crazy. It's human controlled rather than just letting the car do it. And maybe I'll buy Autopilot someday because they gave the discount for people who bought before February 28th. But regardless, I don't mind using regular old cruise control. I think adaptive cruise control is sweet, but I don't mind steering myself. I don't mind adjusting speed myself. It's not a huge deal. So I didn't use Autopilot. Okay, so I have a confession to make. I may have told a small little lie at the beginning of this video when I told you it only took 38 hours to go those 2,000 miles. Actually, it took 45 hours. And where did those 7 extra hours come from? Well, they came from hitting a pothole. I have never liked low-profile tires. I wish they offered something different for the performance model, and it ended up being about a 6.5-hour ordeal because I got a flat hitting a pothole. Now, I didn't want that to be the focus of this video. I wanted the focus of the video to be about the logistics of electric car traveling and not about hitting potholes and having flat tires. But I do think it's something worth talking about, so I'm going to create an additional video discussing it because it was quite a mess, actually, to go through getting a flat flat tire in this vehicle. All right, so now let's talk about the navigation system set up on this car. And this is what's really cool about Tesla's supercharger network, because they make it really easy to do a road trip without having to think very much, which is what I like. I don't want to have to get into a car and have to think about, okay, where do I have to stop every single time? So you just put in your destination. As you can see here, we're just going to drive from Michigan to California, and it gives you all of the stops and an estimation for how long you will remain at each of these supercharger locations. So you can see I'm at 65% battery right now, and my next supercharger I will wait at and charge for 40 minutes, and I'll arrive there with 6%. So personally, I wouldn't actually leave if it only said 6%. I would wait for it to be a little higher. If you're a risky kind of fellow, go for it. So I would charge up a little bit past 65% and then start working my way over to that supercharger. But the other cool thing is if you go to, begin your trip there, and then you look at the energy, there's this trip computer here, and it shows you along those miles that you're going to travel. And so this is a 148-mile stint that we're about to start. It'll take 2 hours and 7 minutes. We'll get there at 5:45 p.m. There you can see that entire list of everything you're going to do and the different charging locations. Arriving in St. Joseph, Michigan, with 6%, need to charge for 40 minutes once you're there. But if you go into the energy here, it shows you your trip. So those 140 some miles, here's where it shows you where the battery will be at along that. And you can also monitor your consumption to see, hey, I've got 65% left. Based on how I've been driving, how far will I get with that 65%? And as you can see, my last 30 miles that I've driven, based on that, 65% is going to give me 229 miles of range. So there's all kinds of information in here if you want to look at it. If you don't, you can just literally follow these instructions, do what it says, go where it says to go, charge in the locations. Once you get to that location, it will tell you, hey, you're here now, you can charge for this long, and then you can go. And it tells you when you can leave again, and it'll tell you, then it'll give you the percentage which you'll arrive at the next destination. And so you know each time what percentage you'll expect to get when you arrive at that next destination. And it will also show you this on your phone. So if you leave, you go to a restaurant or whatever, it'll say, hey, you've got 25 more minutes of charging before you can go, which is really cool. So you know you're sitting there in a restaurant, how long do you want to sit there for? It will show you on your phone. Now these superchargers are pretty fast, so honestly you're not going to have to spend that much time. If you are actually sitting down and eating, wondering, oh man, do I have to stay here? Like, they charge up pretty quick, and I found that on average I was kind of getting, it would tell me that I could leave about 10 minutes before each of these guesstimates here. So it says 40 minutes. I bet in reality I could sit there for 30 minutes and it would say, okay, you're ready to go, but it would give you only that like 6% to 10% buffer of getting there, versus I want to be a bit more on the cautious side and have a bit more than that. But again, it's completely up to you. So the range anxiety portion of it is kind of at how much risk are you willing to take. And you can reduce your speed. Like, let's say worst case, you pull up this energy graph and it says you're not going to get there with any battery. Well, reduce your speed and you'll notice this thing start to go up over time. Because you've reduced your speed, you're driving more efficiently, and you'll actually get there. So if you want to drive at 80 miles per hour and just see how far you can get, maybe you can get there, cool. And then if it doesn't work out, you just drop your speed, and then you can actually make sure you get there. So there's a lot of information to play with here if you're a nerd and want to geek out on it. And there's as little as you need just to get there if you don't want to know all that stuff. I personally wish there was a bit more functionality in here. I think it'd be really cool if you could say, hey, I want a 15% or a 20% buffer. I always want to have that minimum amount when I arrive at my next destination, and then it plugs in the chargers for you. It also doesn't show you the chargers in between. So often there's locations where, there's probably a supercharger between here and here, but it doesn't have you stopping there. So if you use the lower portion of the battery, that battery charges up really fast. For example, I charged from 15% to 65%, 50% of the battery charge in just 20 minutes. So if you were constantly only charging that really fast charge region, then you could probably also get there quicker. And it doesn't allow you to optimize that drive on here. Basically, it just optimizes minimizing stops. So fewer stops rather than more shorter stops. I wish it gave you the flexibility to choose, but it does not. I've heard there's something called like a Better Route Trip Planner, an app or a website out there that you can use that adds in that functionality, but it would be cool if it was built in. Overall, though, the system's pretty easy to use. I mean, you don't have to think very much. You just get in the car and you go. If I were to do this in like a Chevy Bolt or like a Nissan Leaf, I'd have no clue as far as like, okay, where are all these stops? And they would take way, way longer than the 150 kilowatt charging rate that these superchargers provide. So it is really convenient, honestly. A few things, I wish there was a bit more flexibility with it, but overall it's a pretty good system. Now, as far as this estimation curve here, one of the things I kind of wanted to monitor while I was driving is how accurate is it? Because that plays into how comfortable am I listening to, you know, its recommendation. And so I always kept that 15% buffer. The worst case, what happened is I was driving and it said I would arrive with 23%, and instead I arrived with 15%. So that was down 8% from what it said initially. The best case I had, one time I started driving, it was at maybe 15%, then it went down based on the initial portion of the driving to 8%, and I was like, uh-oh, I'm only going to arrive with 8%. And then by the time I got there, it had gone all the way up to 24%. So, you know, 16% better than what it was predicting. Best case, you know, the best, most accurate it had is it guessed 14%, and I got there with 14%. Okay, so what about the active charging itself? What's supercharging like? And it is super easy, which is the good news. I mean, literally you just park, you plug the thing in, and everything's already working. So it's already linked to your Tesla account. You get charged that way. You're not using a credit card or anything like that. You get charged through your Tesla account, and it just immediately starts charging. And I never had an issue. None of them were broken that I came up to. All of them worked out. There was never a line. The most that I saw at one location was 4 cars, and there were 8 stalls, so that was half of them. Most of the time I showed up, it was either no cars or one other car, and that car was gone by the time I left. So they're not staying super long, you know, 30 to 40 minutes, and they're generally out of there, so I never had a problem charging. I haven't driven around California. I would assume there's probably a lot more of these in California, and perhaps charging becomes a real issue with everyone waiting in line. I don't know what it's like out there, but my own experience, there was never a line waiting. Everything always worked. It was really convenient. So these chargers are crazy fast too. I mean, 150 kilowatts. To give you some idea, that's about 500 miles of charge per hour. 150 kilowatts is what it's charging when it's on that lower end. At home with a 240 volt charger, I'm at 7 to 8 kilowatts rather than 250. If you're using a 120 volt outlet, then you're at 1 kilowatt. So 150 times as fast as, you know, a regular old plug at home. So very quick charging. Again, you know, it's going from 15 to 65%, 50% of the battery in just 20 minutes. That was crazy to see how fast it's capable of charging. And then that does start to taper off. So once you get to about 80%, you know, you're coming down to maybe 60, 70 kilowatts. Once you get to 90%, you're charging in only like 30 kilowatts. So it does get significantly slower as you get up into those higher percentages, which is why, you know, from a convenience standpoint, from a timing standpoint, you'd want to be in that lower battery region in order to have the fastest possible road trip, because that's where it charges the quickest. But it charges crazy fast. I mean, literally sit there and watch it go 1%, 1% up. So it's quite cool how fast the superchargers are, how easy they are to use, how simple it all is, and it shows you on the screen, you know, this is what the charging rate is, this is how long it'll take to get to your next stop, how much charge you need to get to your next stop, that kind of thing. So all the information there for you to kind of eliminate that range anxiety, wondering about when do I get to leave, what do I need to do. But I know the question you're likely here for. It's the latest YouTube craze. How cheap can you get into something crazy? And so the question is, how cheap can you get into a Rolls-Royce? I wondered the same, so again, a huge thanks to Autotempest.com for sponsoring this video. Results were looking pretty pricey until spotting a $4,000 Silver Shadow. This is definitely a case of the lister working the angles quite well, as well. There's a bit of damage on the car. But if a Silver Shadow is a must, it looks like they can actually be found in wonderful condition for under $20,000. I'd still recommend a Mazda Miata. Check out Autotempest.com if you are in the market for a used car. It is a wonderful search tool for compiling the results out there. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, of course, feel free to leave those below.